we've been hearing what's happening in Kazakhstan, obviously from the Western media, that there's a revolution against a totalitarian government. However, if you look into the situation, you see a lot of the same regime change playbook, color revolution notes. What exactly is happening in Kazakhstan, and what reasons does the U.S. have to promote yet another color revolution in this region?
Okay, so Kazakhstan, Central Asian, it's a big country. It's 3 times the size of Texas, right? Only some 18, 19 million people, lots of natural resources, oil, gas, uranium. They produce half of the world's uranium at this point, lots of metals. They are not a poor country. Their GDP per capita is on a par with Russia's. There's always the same problems that we all have, whether it's the U.S., Russia, UK, Kazakhstan, with inequality in the country. But the longstanding leader of the country since 92 stepped down in 2019. His, shall we say, bureaucratic, bookish, scholarly foreign minister, Kasim Jomart Tokayev, became president. One of the social domestic issues in the country was the price of basically gas for cars, except in Kazakhstan's case, the major fuel is liquefied petroleum gas, LPG. The problem is the government had a subsidization, price controls of this fuel for years, and the price it was being sold in the country was actually quite a degree lower than the production cost. And on top of that, a lot of black market developed on basically buying it up in the country and then selling it outside the country for a big markup, creating lots of shortage of the fuel that people needed to drive their cars. They removed the price controls, and over a year, prices kept creeping up. And when they reached double what they were a year ago, people got upset about it. They wanted the price controls back. So their protests developed starting in the west of the country, the least populated, where the oil and gas actually is. And these were very specific social protests on an issue. We want these price controls back. And we're talking protests of thousands, right? Not hundreds of thousands, not millions, right? Thousands of people, which, in Kazakhstan, that's already fairly significant. But these protests were almost immediately hijacked. And lots of Western experts who are no fans of Russia or so on have talked about this, like on Eurasian Net, Peter Leonard and so on, and they've acknowledged it. These protests were used as a cover by what was an armed insurrection attempt. And there were traitors within the government, and the head of the Kazakh intelligence services, the KNB, or the National Security Committee, Karim Masimov. He was one of the ones leading this. And he has since been arrested and charged with treason. They were violent, they were organized, they seized key government buildings, media outlets, train stations, airports, banks. And in the early days, there was lots of dead and injured police, and there was a real threat. They had thousands of people. According to the president, now there were some 20,000 trained on the ground. And obviously, this Masimov, he believed that he should have replaced Nazarbayev. He believed that he should have been the president. He's also good business friends with Hunter Biden, and there's pictures of them together. Which I don't think, considering what happened in Ukraine, is kind of a redux version of there. I suspect, and both China and Russia have said that there was a color revolution attempt. That may have been the outside inference. We also saw a Kazakh oligarch in exile. This is Mukhtar Ablyazov, who, by the way, also funded the Tulip Revolution in nearby Kyrgyzstan back in 2005. He is wanted in Kazakhstan for major fraud and embezzlement, billions of dollars, and for killing his business rivals. He fled the country first to the UK, and he was too dirty even for the city of London. The UK charged him with fraud and embezzlement too. he fled to France, which for some reason gave him political asylum, including from the UK, I guess. And he is what Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the U.S. State media outlet, has turned the Kazakh opposition, creating his Democratic Choice for Kazakhstan party. He was deeply involved in this. He, by his own admission, he set up a headquarters in Ukraine that he was operating out of, using the same people that had been involved in overthrowing the government there, the same lessons, the same blame book that they tried to apply to Kazakhstan without as much success there, particularly after the Collective Security Treaty Organization by Russia intervened to back up the Kazakh security forces. But he was deeply involved in this. And he's been again in the news in the last few days, talking about that he wants to overthrow the government in Kazakhstan, regime change, and he just needs more direct Western support. So it's pretty clear he was involved to some extent too. And if we take this oligarch in exile, a traitor linked with the Bidens, as the intelligence director, and these forces that they assembled on the ground, a lot of them Islamists. Kazakhstan is a Muslim majority country, and there is a restive Islamist minority, a more violent, Wahhabist influence out of Saudi Arabia that has resurgence its head. This all led up to this armed insurrection attempt that was put down. And it was put down by Kazakh security forces. The CSTO forces never engaged. There's no indication that the government ever fired on the protesters that these insurrectionists were using as a cover for their regime change attempt. There was a few bystanders caught, but the death toll is about 225. There was no mass firing on crowds or anything like that. But there were thousands of people injured, and at least half of those thousands are the police themselves. But the CSTO forces, they never engaged. They just protected key government institutions and provided moral support, saying, to the Kazakh security and police forces that we got your back. And they've already left the country. They left the country just yesterday. That was the last foreign troops leaving. And now the president has announced major new social contract. He's purged the government of a lot of the old oligarchic elements, and he's basically creating a national social welfare fund where he intends to shake down all of the major privately owned corporations and wealthy individuals to start sharing the wealth around in what is amounting to a major wealth redistribution campaign to make sure that the people are on board with the government going forward.
That's going to be interesting. We're going to have to pay attention to that because the West is going to try to demonize that movement every single step of the way.
Who's the biggest foreign oil company in Kazakhstan? Chevron.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the CSTO, I believe it's called, those forces.
The Collective Security Treaty Organization, yes.
Can you give us a little insight to that? Because I know there were troops coming in from Belarus, from Russia, I believe Uzbekistan, and a couple other countries. So the Western media tried to take that and spin that as, look what Putin's doing. He's sending in troops now to Kazakhstan to cause problems. Why don't you explain about how that is kind of like that unity is formed and what their responsibilities are?
Yeah, we had Blinken, a very high degree of projection here, saying once Russians come into your country, it's very hard to get them out, right? Yeah. Hello, Syria, Iraq, Germany, Japan. Anyway, the Collective Security Treaty Organization is a loose analog in Eurasia of NATO. It's led by Russia. They responded to the pleas from the Kazakh government. They sent some 2,500 lightly armed peacekeepers. Almost 2,000 of those were Russians. There were a few hundred Belarusians, some Tajiks, some Armenians. And what they did was they guarded key government buildings and institutions. Their rules of engagement was they don't engage with protesters. They don't engage with armed insurrectionists unless fired upon. And they didn't. They just provided some backup, making sure that the key government buildings were secured to free up Kazakh security forces to deal with their own security. They finished, and they're all already out of the country. And Blinken, if anyone actually, goes back and calls him on his comments, looks like a propagandistic fool again.
Well, I think that's all the questions I have, Pasta.
Yeah, I mean,
do you have any other questions?
Well, I mean, he kind of answered them, right? Like going forward, now we have a new kind of like reformist kind of president there who's going to try to take some of the money away from the corporations and spread the wealth out. How are they going to deal with the uranium situation, though? I mean, you talked about one of the natural resources being uranium. Isn't the West going to, if it's half the uranium comes from Kazakhstan, isn't the West going to continue to try to get their claws on that and somehow get in there and get to that uranium? In other words, can we expect more actions from the West like we are seeing in Ukraine in Kazakhstan?
It's really hard for the U.S. and Kazakhstan because Kazakhstan, the only sea border they have is with the Caspian Sea, which is also, not connected to any of the major world oceans. It's effectively a big lake with a high saltwater content. And it's wedged in between China and Russia, right? It's very hard for the U.S. to do, what they do there. And I think the U.S. is afraid that if they continue to more overtly, meddle in Kazakh affairs, then the Kazakh government will nationalize all of the Western companies' oil assets in the country, and then they'll be completely out. I think it's actually the oil and gas that they're more interested in. And that oil and gas is not oil and gas that's going back to the U.S. It's, of course, oil that is being sold to China. And, for a nice markup. And the concern there is, control of China's oil supply. But the U.S. isn't the only foreign country involved in the energy industry there. Russia and China are also both involved there. And at the end of the day, they're dominant. And they do not compete with each other there very much. They have managed, through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which Russia, China, and Kazakhstan are all also both a part of, to manage their influence and the development of Central Asia to help it out between them. And things have worked out pretty well there. China backed up the CSTO intervention, and they warned about, color revolutions. And they said it was unacceptable and Western meddling was unacceptable. So they seem to be on the same page here. I think that of all, Ukraine, borders Europe, so it's a different story. But Kazakhstan, they tried their best and it wasn't anywhere near good enough.
Another failed revolution, color revolution for the West. I mean, they've had a few failures lately. So I think the tide is definitely changing to more countries having bilateral relationships compared to the unilateral type of foreign policy that has dominated so many countries for so long.
Yeah, they're definitely, the unipolar moment is over.
Yeah. And I don't want to see Russia and China back down. Like, you won't see a Russia in 2014 anymore. That's gone. We already see what's going on with Hong Kong and China. It's different days, and the United States needs to wake up and smell the coffee. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the senior analyst, foreign policy, Mark Sleboda, for the Convo Couch. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. This was amazing information. I appreciate it.
It's always fun to be on with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
You guys were awesome in Nicaragua.
Thank you.
You were watching me. I was watching you.
Yeah, it's true.
Thanks, Mark.
Oh.
Bye.